Everybody to today's session, Learning Strategies and Technologies, What Actually Works with Stephen Just. So Stephen is the Chief Learning Officer of IntelliLearning. Previously, he was the founder and CEO of Pedagogue Solutions, the premier assessment management system company, which he sold to a leading learning management system company. Dr. Just has a master's degree in computer science, a doctorate in educational psychology, and over 25 years experience creating learning and assessment strategies using the latest research in cognitive science. He has taught hundreds of workshops, is a regular contributor to Focus, the professional magazine of the Life Science Trainers and Educators Network, LTEN, and is a member of the LTEN Editorial Advisory Board. He also teaches full-day workshops on the science of learning and assessment. And I will include his contact information in the chat, so if anybody wants to get in touch with him, and I'm sure that he includes some of that information in his presentation. So with that, I'm going to stop my share and give you control so you can take over.
That's great. Thank you, Jesse.
You're welcome.
Share my screen here. Hope you can all see it.
Yep.
Good. Okay, great. So as Jesse mentioned, I have a background in both computer science and educational psychology. And I spent the first 15 years or so of my career actually doing research in learning technology and learning strategies. Since then, I've worked, as Jesse mentioned, more on the vendor side, creating learning solutions. But one of the things I've never stopped doing is keeping up with the academic literature. I spend a reasonable amount of my time reading learning journals and trying to understand what is effective as far as instructional strategies are concerned and technologies. And so I'd like to make a couple of statements to begin. If people disagree with what I have to say, I'm more than happy. My colleague Pete Sanford is in the session as well, Jesse too, and they will be monitoring the chat. But one of the problems I see, working on the vendor side and also a lot of clients and seeing other vendors, et cetera, is the field of learning is highly susceptible to the allure of plausible but untested ideas, fads, and hype. Anyone who's worked in the field for a while knows, as well as I do, that every couple of years, the latest, greatest learning technology or strategy comes along, and everyone promotes it. And lots of products come out using it. But my feeling as an educational psychologist is that if learning is a science, then effectiveness claims should be subject to the same rigorous verification as other scientific fields. So if you're going to claim that an instructional strategy works, then it's important that you be able to demonstrate that it works. If you're going to claim that your new learning technology is superior to other learning technologies or is an effective learning technology, then you ought to be able to demonstrate that. Otherwise, we're just taking shots in the dark. We don't really know what's effective and what's not effective. Our company, Intella, and my prior companies too, we did a lot of work in the pharmaceutical industry. And as you know, the pharmaceutical industry is subject to regulation by the FDA, and they have to go through a series of clinical trials in order to establish the effectiveness of their products. Now, learning is not quite a science in the way that, say, physics or chemistry or biology is a science, but you can test your learning ideas. And so whenever I think about it or hear about a learning strategy or technology, one of the things that I always do is I begin to research it, and I look to see what the research says about that strategy or technology. So we're going to look at 7 strategies and technologies today, and we're going to see what the science of learning says about those strategies and technologies. I'm not talking about what vendors say about them. I'm not talking about what people with products to sell say about them or services to sell. I'm talking about what independent research shows about them. We're going to look at animation, text and narration, video quality, emotions in learning, microlearning, e-learning, blended learning, and instructor-led training, testing for learning, and virtual reality. And this workshop is actually a subset of a much larger workshop I teach, a half-day workshop on modern learning. And so necessarily I've left out some strategies and technologies from the larger workshop. So here's the format. Here's how it's going to work. I'm going to pose a poll question, which will be, I'll ask a question about a strategy or technology, and I'll say, what do you think? Does it work or not work? And then we're going to look at the research literature and see what the research literature says about it. And I'll rate each of these strategies and technologies into one of three categories. It'll get a green check mark, meaning, yeah, the research literature supports this. It's actually an effective way to teach people. And X means, as you might guess, that, you know what, I don't care if people are doing it. I don't really care that it's a popular strategy. I don't care that vendors have developed a lot of products around it. There's no evidence that this actually works. And then there's the question mark. Question mark means, we're not sure, mixed evidence. There are really two reasons something could get a question mark. One is it's a new technology. We just haven't done a lot of research on it yet. So we don't know. We don't know for certain. And we'll know a few years in the future, perhaps. The other is the evidence is mixed. As I mentioned briefly before, learning's not quite a hard science. If I take a lead weight and I go to the top of the building and I drop it off the building, it's going to take a certain amount of time to hit the ground. And if I go up to the top of that building tomorrow and drop the lead weight, it's going to take the exact same amount of time. Learning's not quite like that. We get different results based upon different groups of people, different ages of people, and so different backgrounds of people, and so on, and how the strategy or technology is implemented. So what I look for is preponderance of evidence. Do most studies seem to support this idea? I try to look at meta-analyses, if I can find analyses that cover a number of different studies. And let me just give you an example of something with a question mark, something that is slightly outside our field. It's more in the education field, less than the corporate training field. But the notion of class size and learning outcomes. It might seem intuitive to us that the fewer students there are in the class, the better the learning outcomes. That just seems like kind of obvious. But it turns out it's not really true. And here's a large meta-analysis that was published relatively recently, just a little over a year ago. Smaller class sizes are not always better for pupils, a multinational study shows. So why is that? I mean, there are probably a lot of reasons that the research literature is mixed. Might have to do with the quality of the teacher. Maybe a good teacher can teach well, no matter how many students he or she has in the classroom. Maybe it has to do with the socioeconomic background of the students. Maybe students from high socioeconomic backgrounds are going to learn no matter what, because they come from families that can help them. Maybe it's a nonlinear relationship. We could probably say, if you're teaching one person versus teaching 11 people, yeah, you know what? There's probably a big advantage to direct tutoring of a single person. But if you're teaching 60 people versus 70 people, maybe there's not much of a difference. So it's nonlinear. So it's complicated. Learning outcomes aren't always straightforward. So before we jump into looking at strategies and technologies, it's important to understand a little bit about the science of memory and how learning actually occurs. I'm going to run through this fairly quickly, but it's important background information. There are actually three parts to memory that aid in learning. There's sensory storage, working memory, and long-term memory. Some of you have studied cognitive psychology probably know this. But what's really important is that we forget at all stages of the learning process. Forgetting's a feature, not a bug, of our brains, because we can't possibly remember every detail that we encounter in the course of a day. And that's what happens with sensory storage. Sensory storage is everything we experience, everything we hear, everything we see. We forget most of it. By far and away, we forget most of it. What we do want to remember, we pass along to working memory. But working memory is very limited. It can only hold 3 or 4 objects at a time. So anything we want to remember long-term, we pass along into working memory, into long-term memory, excuse me. The problem is long-term memory is not like a computer disk. It's not permanent. There's storage decay in long-term memory. We forget a lot of what we want to remember. We all know this. We'll learn something, we'll say, oh, I have to remember that. That's important. An hour later, a day later, a week later, we can't remember it. So there are methods for reinforcing what we've learned in long-term memory, and that's by recalling from long-term memory back into working memory, processing what we have brought back into working memory, and then restoring it into long-term memory. It's called encoding and re-encoding. It goes under a number of different terms that you will encounter if you read the literature. It's often called retrieval practice, or it's called the Dewar effect. It's called cognitive effort. It's called desirable difficulties. It comes under a lot of different words, but basically terms. Well, basically, whatever you want to remember, you need to work at, you need to process. And this is an important part of what makes a learning strategy effective. The second thing is that our working memory is really divided into 2 parts. There are verbal processes and nonverbal processes, words, if you will, and images. And they are connected but separate. And we have to be very, very careful about not overloading either of these 2 domains. So the verbal processes are where we process what we read, what we hear, etc. And the nonverbal process are where we process what we see, like a picture or an animation or something like that. So once again, we're going to go through each of these 7 strategies and technologies. I'm going to ask you a polling question. You're going to vote. Hopefully this works. We tested it quickly earlier today. And we will then look at what the research says about whether or not this is a way to actually do valid and long-term learning. So animation, text, and narration. Let's begin with a polling question. And the question is, oops, go forward. Jesse, for some reason I'm not, there it is, okay, got it. Come back here. Okay, so if you have an animation course, it is best to accompany the animation with text only, narration only, or text and narration. So I'm going to launch a poll and give you a few seconds to vote. So do you think an animation should be accompanied by text only, narration only, or text and narration? Okay, the results seem kind of evenly split. I'll end the poll here. And we'll share the results. The poll is evenly split between narration only and text and narration. So what do we know from cognitive psychology, and what does that tell us? Close down the poll, and let's see. There is something called the dual coding effect, which means that processes or learning that uses both the verbal process and the nonverbal process is superior to learning that uses either just the verbal process or the nonverbal process. The problem is either of these processes, remember working memory is very limited, can be easily overloaded. It's called cognitive load. They can be easily overloaded. If you have both text and narration, you will overload the verbal process. So you can have text or you can have narration along with the animation, but you should not have both. And preferably you should have narration because you're listening and seeing at the same time. You're not reading and seeing at the same time. So accompany animations and video with audio for maximum effectiveness, not audio and text. And I've seen many courses that do both audio and text. So there's an animation going on the screen, there's text, and then someone is reading the text. Or there's even a still image, there's text and it's being read. One or the other, not both. Let's talk about video quality for a moment. As you're probably all aware, especially those of you who've been working and learning for a while, it used to be that if you wanted to do video, you hired a video production company and they came out with their really expensive equipment and they filmed video and they charged you a lot of money for doing so. Now, we all have these devices that we carry that we can use for filming video. They're cheap. It's very simple to use, and anyone can do it. But the question then becomes, learning is more effective when using high quality video, low quality video, or there is no difference. So let's launch the second poll question. Give you a few seconds to vote. Okay. And the poll here. Show the results. So most of you said there is no difference. Some of you, a couple of you said that high quality video is superior to low quality video. I give this talk and there are often vendors in the office, in the audience, and some of them create expensive high quality videos. And they get upset when I talk about this. So let me just stop sharing. And let's see what the research says. How video production, this is a study that was done by these three researchers, one from MIT, one from Rochester, and one from edX. People might or might not be familiar with edX. It's a online MOOC. Philip Guo has done a lot of research with millions of videos that have been taken over the edX platform. And so he analyzed how video production affects student engagement, an empirical study of MOOC videos. And his conclusion was that a meta-analysis of 7 million videos and 128,000 students concluded that videos that have a more personal feel are more engaging than high fidelity studio recordings. That is, he measured engagement in terms of the length of time students are willing to watch the videos, whether or not the students actually attempted to answer the post-video questions. So he found that videos that have a more personal feel, that are shot on something like an iPhone, for example, are more engaging. Students will engage with them for longer periods of time than high fidelity studio recordings. Here's a large meta-analysis of videos and online learning. And here was their conclusion. Expensive production techniques are often used in video production, despite a lack of evidence that a high production style leads to better learning outcomes. So my message is, do not invest in high production value video unless there's good reason to do so. I'm not against high production value video. Indeed, there are many vendors who create online content in pharma. And if they're doing something like the mechanism of action of a drug or anatomy and physiology of one of the body systems, high production value is good and it's important. But if you're working for a company and you're hiring a vendor to create e-learning for you, please be aware and think about, do you really need to invest in high production value, or can you get away with low production value shot on an iPhone or a lesser device? Because it can often be less expensive, can often be more effective than high production value video. Okay, let's talk about emotions and learning. This is a big topic. I know that a lot of people lecture on the use of emotions in learning. So here's the question: what impact do emotions have on learning? They either improve learning, they inhibit learning, or it depends. So we'll launch the poll. Okay. So what impact do emotions have on learning? It depends, they inhibit learning, or they improve learning. Good, okay, let's end the poll, show the results. And almost everyone says it depends. So let's see what the research says about that. And the research is actually interesting because the research goes back over 100 years. And people are probably unaware of this research. Most people, I think, are unaware of this research. It was done in 1908 by Yerkes and Dodson. And if you look along the x-axis, they have something called what they call arousal, which is emotions. And then they have performance over on the left-hand side, on the y-axis. And what they found was that with increasing arousal, with increasing emotion, students paid increasing attention and interest to the material. And the performance was positively affected until they reached a point of optimal arousal and optimal performance. Beyond that point, however, performance dropped off. Performance was impaired because of strong anxiety. Now, a lot of other research has been done on emotions and learning, and what they find is the following. Emotions and learning are kind of a double-edged sword. Difficult or intellectually demanding tasks may require a lower level of arousal to facilitate concentration. Tasks demanding stamina or persistence may be performed better with higher levels of arousal to increase motivation. So, a classic case of that might be sales representatives or something like that. You want to get them charged up before they go out and sell. In the military, obviously, it's important to get soldiers a high level of emotional arousal before they go into battle. It's a double-edged sword. And for those of us who normally do training around the cognitive side, knowledge-based training, you need to calibrate the amount of emotional of emotions that you impart in the learning. Microlearning, very hot topic these days. Our company, IntelliLearning, is a microlearning company. We have a platform, and we also create microlearning content as well. And I think, most people kind of agree, and I don't really have time to go into this, too much today about why microlearning works, but it does work. You'll have to take that as an article of faith from me at the moment. But there's lots of research that shows that if you chunk long learning courses into smaller nuggets, it is effective. And if you spread them out over time, it is effective. But one of the disputes in microlearning, and is how long should a microlearning be? And here I'm talking about a video. It could be an audio, it could be a podcast, it could be anything. But what should be the maximum length of microlearning videos? And people have opinions about this. No more than 2 minutes, no more than 6 minutes, no more than 12 minutes. I went to a conference once a few years ago where someone said, we could limit our microlearning to 18 minutes. And someone asked him why. He said, well, that's the length of an average TED Talk. Okay. There's no research behind that, but that's what he said. So the question for you then is, what is the optimal length? What should the maximum length be of a microlearning video? 3, 6, 9, or 12 minutes? I'm going to launch the poll. Good. We actually have a good split, among the choices. That's because people haven't seen a lot of research on this topic, and people have their own feelings or opinions, and feelings and opinions are fine. but I'm all about trying to find the research that will help me understand what actually works. So let's take a look at the research. Close the poll. So this same researcher from Rochester looked at all these edX videos, and he tried to measure, or he actually did measure, how long students stayed engaged with the videos. And these are typically college students or adults. How long they stayed engaged with the video. And here's what he found. Student engagement with streaming videos. He had near 100% engagement up to 6 minutes. And beyond 6 minutes, the engagement started dropping off. Dropped down to about 90% between 6 and 9 minutes, and it took a sharp drop after 9 minutes. So the next time you're in a meeting in your company, the next time you're creating microlearning for a client, if you're a vendor, you can cite this research. This research, his conclusion is that, the optimal video length is 6 minutes or shorter. You can probably go up to 9 minutes, but certainly not more than that. Say up to 9 minutes or so, you'll still get 90%. Students watch most of the way through these short videos. In fact, the average engagement time of any video maxes out at 6 minutes, regardless of its length. So if you give me a 10-minute video, I'm going to watch 6 minutes of it. If you give me an hour video, I'm going to watch 6 minutes of it. That's what he's saying. So learners' attention declines rapidly after approximately 6 minutes. E-learning, blended learning, and ILT. Which of the following instructional strategies is most effective? Instructor-led training, e-learning, or blended learning? And as you would imagine, a lot of research has been done on this. Losing my ability to share the polls. Jesse, do you know why I can't share this poll? Oh, there it goes. Okay. Okay. Let's share poll question number 5. Launch the poll. Okay. So what's the most effective instructional strategy? Instructor-led training, e-learning, or blended learning? Vast majority of you said blended learning. So let's look at and see what the research says. This is obviously important these days since we're not doing a lot of ILT. Is e-learning superior to blended learning? Is blended learning superior to e-learning? And if we're not doing a lot of ILT, have we lost something in the process? So this study, face-to-face versus online training for the interpretation of findings, and it was basically they were training medical students to do endoscopies. And here's what they found. They took what had been actually interpret the results of endoscopies, not actually do endoscopies. And here's what they found. Incorporating technology into these two courses yielded comparable gains to traditional lectures. So what they found was that instructor-led training and e-learning gave approximately the same results on final exams. So there was no great benefit of e-learning over instructor-led training and no benefit of instructor-led training over e-learning. They more or less gave the same results. Here was a big meta-analysis of online learning. It was done by the Department of Education. So the caveat here is that this was done with students, K through 12. And but it was a big meta-analysis, so I'd like to include it. And here's what they found. E-learning is equal to or slightly less effective than instructor-led training. But blended learning is more effective than e-learning or instructor-led training alone. And with an effect size of 0.35, which is a good effect size. That's a pretty nice effect size. You don't often get effect sizes that large. So in this meta-analysis, they found that blended learning was superior. Let's look at another study. This was done with college students at Carnegie Mellon. They had a statistics course, which they put online, and they tried to measure, or they measured the effectiveness of the online statistics course versus an instructor-led course. And here's what they found. There were 3 exams during the course of the semester, and then there was a final exam. Blue is the traditional course, red is the online course. And what they found was the results were about the same. The instructor-led course and the traditional course gave approximately the same results as far as learning outcomes. Then what they did was they created something called the accelerated course. And they weren't really so much looking to measure learning outcomes, though they did. What they were really looking to see was if we create a blended approach where we allowed students to go through the course, since it's e-learning, at their own pace, but engage with instructors as well, could they go through the course more quickly? And then secondarily, what would their final exam performance be? And what they found was that students who took the blended approach, online learning plus instructor-led training, not only outperformed on the final exam by quite a lot, by approximately 10% over the traditional instructor-led course, but they also completed the course in approximately half the time because they're able to go at their own pace. So, is mixed. E-learning is slightly less effective than or as effective as instructor-led training, but blended learning is more effective than either e-learning or ILT alone. And that's sort of the blended learning model is the kind of the flipped classroom model, right? Where students attend lectures online and then meet in smaller groups. Used to be in person, now it's in virtually with instructors. Testing for learning. Testing is a big topic these days, as I'm sure you all know. So frequent testing enhances learning, is detrimental to learning, neither helps nor hurts. Question number 6. So frequent testing enhances learning, is detrimental to learning, neither helps nor hurts. Okay, we seem to have an even split here between enhances learning and neither helps nor hurts. No one selected as detrimental to learning. So let's take a look at what the research says about this, because the research is actually quite clear as far as testing is concerned. And there's actually been a lot of research on it too. So this was done by a study done at Washington University in St. Louis by this Professor Roediger, who's done a lot of research in this area. He had students study a series of pictures, and they were told to remember as many of them as they could. Afterwards, group 1 left the lab. He divided them into 3 groups. Group 2 wrote down as many pictures as they could remember. And group 3 had 3 successive opportunities to write down as many pictures as they could remember. Then a test was administered 1 week later. What he found was, and he considered the writing down of the pictures to be a test. like a test. It's causing you to have to recall what you've learned. And the group that had one opportunity to write down the pictures that they remembered outperformed the group that had no opportunity to do so. And the group that had 3 opportunities outperformed both of the other 2 groups. So in this case, clearly, repeated testing helped people remember what they were learning. So in this other article, in this other study done by Roediger and 2 other people, Karpicki and Butler, they took, again, a class and they divided into 4 groups. They had group A given 4 study sessions with some material, followed by a final exam with a 2-minute delay between study sessions. Group B had 3 study sessions, followed by 1 open response test with a 2-minute delay, no feedback after the test. And then group C had 1 study session, followed by 3 open response tests, no feedback after the test. So it was 4 study sessions versus 3 study sessions and a test versus 1 study session and 3 tests. Then they gave a test of recall 5 minutes later and 1 week later. Here's what they found. 5 minutes later, the group that studied had 4 study sessions outperformed the other 2 groups, the study test group and the study test group. But 1 week later, they performed the poorest. And the group that had the most opportunity to be tested outperformed substantially the study group, and they also outperformed the study test group. And the reason for that is what I went over back at the beginning of this when I was talking about how we learn. When you store something in long-term memory, it doesn't matter if you read it and reread it and reread it as often as you want. You're going to forget it unless you exercise that long-term memory. And exercise means, in this case, testing, it's retrieved back into working memory and then re-encoded back into long-term memory. And that strengthens the connections of the neurons in long-term memory. This retrieval effect has been shown again and again and again in learning. And so retrieval practice enhances learning. There's no doubt about it. It's one of the strongest effects that exists in the learning of literature. There are entire books written about the benefits of retrieval practice. So we have to distinguish testing. I do a lot of work in the area of testing. I ran a testing company for many years. We have to distinguish testing for learning and testing of learning. Testing is a very effective way of learning. And as a matter of fact, there's lots of research also that shows that rereading and highlighting and underlining and all those things we all did in college are not effective at all. They don't work in the least. They absolutely don't work in the least. So let's look at now, finally, one of the hottest topics in learning today, virtual reality. You know, lots of vendors out there selling virtual reality headsets as a means of learning. And we'll take a look at this poll. Virtual reality is more effective than other forms of training, less effective than other forms of training, or equally as effective as other forms of training. Launch the poll. Okay, there's a typo in the last line there. Equally effective as other forms of training, not than. You know, I became interested in this when I went to a workshop by a vendor who sells virtual reality training, and it was very impressive. And I got to play with the headset, and he was a pharma vendor, and so he was teaching sales representatives all about colonoscopies, and so you got to actually find polyps in the colon, remove polyps from the colon, and so on. I asked him at the end of the workshop, well, this is great, but how much did it cost? You know, vendors never want to talk about costs at a workshop, but he was very sort of non-committal. And so I kind of pressed him a little bit. I said, well, tell me, if I did this as just a 3D graphic, classic e-learning, graphic imagery, versus virtual reality, how much more expensive was developing the virtual reality training versus animated e-learning? And he said about 3 times more expensive. Now, this was a few years ago. The cost of virtual reality has come down quite a bit since then. But it got me thinking, is it really worth 3 times as much? So let's take a look at what the research says. Let me show the results first. It's kind of evenly split. Some of you thought it was more effective, some less effective, and some equally effective. So let's see what the research says. So this was it wasn't a headset, it was a virtual reality simulator in which medical students were being trained to do general surgery, endoscopies. So they did a randomized controlled trial of general surgery and internal medicine residents, on teaching them how to do endoscopies. Some of the students, they divided students into 2 groups. Half received simulator training, while the controls received no additional training. And then both groups then performed a colonoscopy on a live patient, presumably under the watchful eye of an actual surgeon. So residents trained on the colonoscopy simulator performed significantly better in the clinical settings than controls, demonstrating skill transfer to live patients. Now that's fine, that's wonderful. But to me, this sort of study is meaningless. I mean, I have no doubt that if you train someone in any way, whether it's e-learning, ILT, simulator, virtual training, virtual headsets, virtual reality, whatever it is, whatever you want, they're going to learn. People are going to learn. So if you compare them to a group that wasn't trained, then of course they're going to do better. So to me, then, the real question is, can we devise an experiment in which we compare virtual reality training to other forms of training? And so I found this study from Cornell in which they were teaching undergraduates about phases of the moon. And they divided the students up into 3 groups. One group used virtual reality headsets. A second used a computer simulation, an online simulation of the moon and the earth and the sun. And the third used old-fashioned material objects. Those of us who are somewhat older, maybe they still use them in schools, I don't know. We had these models where you had a kind of a sun sitting in the middle, and then you had the earth rotating around the sun, and then you had the moon rotating around the earth, and you studied it that way. And so they then compared, they did an exam afterwards, and they studied the outcomes from these 3 groups. And what they found was there was no significant difference in learning among the 3 groups. So whether you used a expensive high-end VR headset or used literally an old-fashioned material model of the solar system, going back to maybe 100 years, who knows how long those have been in use. There was no difference in learning outcomes. So at the moment, there's not a lot of evidence that VR is more effective than other forms of training. It's just not there. The research isn't there. That's not to say you would never use virtual reality. It's very useful and justified for skills-based training where there's danger to the learner. Say you're learning to operate a nuclear power plant. Danger to the patient or subject, as in the case of medical VR training. You want the learners to practice before they go out and actually perform the surgery on a live patient, where there's a lack of practice subjects and opportunities. So for example, maybe you're training medical students in a rural area and there are not a lot of patients around for them to practice on. VR is a good substitute there. And other forms of training are equally or more expensive. Simulators, for example, can be very expensive, obviously, to build. So if you're comparing VR training to a simulator, then VR training is perhaps justified. So the bottom line here is that as long as VR training is more expensive than other forms of training, it may not be justified unless it meets the prior criteria. Now, I was giving this talk at a conference, I guess it was about 1.5 years ago. Well, I know it was well over 6 months ago because it was a live conference. And there was a vendor, a VR vendor in the room, and she got really upset with me. I explained to her, look, I'm not for or against any form of training or any instructional strategy. I simply look at the research and I say, what does the research say? And I said to her, look, if you can send me some studies that that justify the use of VR as a form of training and show that it outperforms other methods of training, then great, fine, send them to me. You know, the truth is she never really did convince me that it's better than other forms of training. And so my feeling is it's cool, it's great, it's got a really great halo effect there. But as long as it's more expensive, it's something to be looked at with a critical eye, especially if you're a client, if you're working in a company and a vendor is trying to sell you an expensive VR solution. So we have a few minutes left. I'm just going to do a bonus round here for those of you who are still taking tests, or for those of you who have children who are taking tests in school. There's one conventional piece of wisdom that I think we were all taught when we were taking tests, and that is that our first answer to a test question is the best one. I mean, I think most people hear this at some point in their schooling career. If you answer a question and you think your answer is right, or you're not sure, but you're not so sure about the other answers, don't change your answer, because your first answer is the best answer. Well, a group of people actually went out and tested this assumption. And here's what they found. They looked at 20 different studies of learners changing answers on tests. And these days, most exams, or many exams certainly, are given online. So we can actually see, if we track that, if the system tracks that, this person answered to B, and then he changed his answer to C, and whether he was changing it from right to wrong or wrong to right, and so on. And here's what these people found. Okay, let me interpret this table for you. So the first row of the table, the students who changed their answer, 57% or almost 58% of the students changed their answer, the first answer, when they changed it from wrong to right. Meaning, if the correct answer, say, was B, and they selected A the first time, 57% of the time, they changed their answer to B. 20% changed their right answer to a wrong answer, and 22% changed their wrong answer to another wrong answer. So more than 50% of the time, students who changed their answer changed it from an incorrect answer to a correct answer, thus violating or putting to rest the myth that you should never change your answer on a test. So analysis of 20 studies showed that students are twice as likely to change their answer from wrong to right than from right to wrong. Now, I'm not suggesting you always change your first answer, because if you're sure it's the right answer, you should. But if you're not sure, there's no penalty in changing it. And in fact, more than 50% of the time, students actually change it from wrong to right rather than from right to wrong. Okay, so we're done. this is my contact information. If people are interested in more data, if they want to dispute anything I said, if they have studies that they find that contradict anything I've said, that's great. I'm constantly updating this workshop. I'm always trying to look at new research. I'm more than willing to say that and suggest, to accept that I was wrong, or that new research is showing that I was wrong about something that I contended to be true. I'd love to hear from people. Are there, Pete, are there any questions or comments in the chat that we should be tending to?
There are, Stephen. Hi, everybody. This is Pete Sanford. I'm one of the principals of IntelliLearning. And Stephen, as Jesse had mentioned, is the Chief Learning Officer of our organization. There are some questions that have been posted in the chat, Stephen, and for those of you that posted those, feel free to unmute your mic and certainly chime in on the conversation. Jesse, you had posted something about his video, the same though as microlearning. Can you clarify what you meant by that?
Yeah, sure. I guess I was wondering, because the study that you had mentioned said that it was video that they were using, and I wanted to see if there was any clarification on the difference between video and, say, a short e-learning course or something where there's actually a certain level of interaction, and if that makes any difference.
Yeah, that's a good question, Jesse. I don't really know the answer to it. I think that I suspect, it's similar. There's a large body of research that shows that our brain operates in two ways: focused and diffuse. And it turns out that we're only capable of practicing in a focused mode for a relatively short period of time, and then we need to relax, and then we can go back to focusing. He happened to do a study with videos, which is why I said video. But I suspect the same holds true for a podcast or something that, kind of a micro course, if you will, a short interactive lesson. Obviously, if you're engaged, people listen to podcasts for 45 minutes or an hour, or watch movies for 2 hours or 3 hours without losing attention. So people are capable of engaging for longer periods of time. But when you're trying to learn, when you're really trying to learn something, meaning you're focusing on it, you're trying to remember, you're trying to understand, then I think that lesson is true for any type of microlearning.
Thank you.
Thanks. Someone from Sage had asked about the data concerning flight simulators. I think this is in reference to your virtual reality section.
Sure. Yeah, flight simulators are great. Obviously, pilots are trained in them all the time. There's lots of research that shows that they work. You don't want a pilot trainee taking up a multi-million-dollar jet before that pilot trainee has been trained on a flight simulator. But obviously flight simulators are very expensive. The airlines can afford them, maybe not now, but they could afford them before 6 months ago. Flight simulators are great, and they work really, really well. And I'm not against virtual reality. I think virtual reality is fine, but you just have to justify the cost if there are other ways of doing the training that are just as effective.
Okay. And then Kathy Goller, thank you, Kathy, for posting this. She said she's been reading Wired to Grow by Dr. Britt Andreatta. She maintains that the research shows that focus is limited to about 15 minutes. Stephen, I don't know if you're familiar with that, that book.
Yeah, I don't know the book, but I know the research on focusing. And actually, some people said 25 minutes that focus. But there's something, people may be familiar with something called the Pomodoro method. In the Pomodoro method, you work for 25 minutes, take a 5-minute break, work for 25 minutes, take a 5-minute break, and so on. And in fact, when I teach my workshops, my 3-hour workshops, I do that. I teach them in 25-minute segments and then give a 5-minute break. Focusing is limited to 15 minutes, 25 minutes, less than a half hour, certainly for sure. This particular research happened to be on online videos. That's the research I cite.
Okay. And Peter, Peter Rizza had put some comments in the chat. Anything you want to share with folks, or do you have a question? Then I know, Jesse, you have something to get in before we all head out.
Yeah, Stephen, you were talking about the benefits of testing the STTT group or whatever. But those are all recall based, and that's kind of a lower level testing. Maybe it's not low level, but it's not application, or it's not a principle, it's not a rule, it's not
Sure.
a sequence. How do those same the same results or
Yes.
the same benefits for higher level as well?
Yes,
Is there research for that?
They absolutely do. Again, it's called the doer effect or the doing effect.
Mm-hmm.
You have to try to apply what you've learned. I think we kind of know that intuitively. God, we all grew up with the practice makes perfect mantra from our parents.
But my question is, like, in recall, they had instruction, then they had a test. If
Yeah.
it's application or some kind of higher level principle, would there be
Right.
instruction, a test, maybe some clarification, and then still some introduction of instruction, or would they just really be left on their own after the first shot?
Right. Yeah, I think there's a lot of research on feedback, Peter, that shows that good structured feedback is helpful. So they try the skill, they get feedback, they get coaching.
Corrective feedback at the time they're trying it.
Exactly. Then they try the skill again, and so on. Yeah, there's a lot of research on that.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Peter. And then finally, Jesse, I know you have something to say, but Diane, you had asked about virtual ILT, which certainly we're all living in that world right now. Stephen, I don't know, it's not sure if you have data that really.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't have, if someone has a study comparing ILT, live ILT versus virtual ILT, I'd love to see it. I don't have any data on that.
Yeah, and in particular, she was asking about the 25 minutes and 5-minute break.
Yeah,
so I would think about the design of virtual workshops. Is that relevant there?
Yeah, certainly, I think it's relevant there. Might even be relevant to have more breaks more often in the virtual workshop. But I'd love to see some research. There's certainly a lot of virtual training going on now, even with kids that unfortunately are not capable of sitting still for long periods of time.
Right.
I'd love to see some research comparing live instructor-led versus virtual instructor-led.
Yep. Okay, Jesse, final comments?
Yeah, thank you. So thank you everybody for coming. I just wanted to point out that we're going to keep this session open for a virtual happy hour. So, feel free to hang out. We're going to have an open chat and a debrief of the day. And it'll take a few minutes for the other attendees from some of the other sessions to get to this one. So I'm sure we'll be seeing more attendees come in. So feel free to hang out. And, if you want, continue this discussion, and then we'll incorporate it into other stuff that might kind of dribble up as more people come into this chat area.
Great.
Thanks, Jesse.
All right, then I guess we'll stand by.
Yeah, I thought this was fascinating. I mean, it's highly applicable, I think, to what I do. It kind of allows me to figure, okay, what are the best methods that I can bring to bear on helping to support the sales organization that I'm supporting at this point?
Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate that those of us who have worked in this field and feel we're professionals don't really take advantage or spend time trying to figure out what really works. There is research literature. If you were a physician, you wouldn't just have some vendor come in, pharma companies do it all the time, obviously, and say, hey, this product is better than that product, or this product works. You ask for evidence. You always ask for evidence. Most fields, you ask for evidence. And yet, in my experience, and I've been doing this for a long time, vendors go into companies and